You don't actually lack discipline. You lack honesty about what you're choosing every single day. Because if it really mattered to you, you would not still be postponing it. You would not still be getting ready for a life you already understand clearly in your mind. The truth is uncomfortable, you are aware, but not committed. And that gap is where your days disappear. Think about a normal moment. You wake up, you already know the one task that would change the direction of your day. It's not complicated. It's not unclear. But you avoid it anyway. You open your phone, you delay the discomfort, you negotiate with yourself like there is still time left to waste. That negotiation feels harmless in the moment, but it quietly builds a pattern you keep repeating. And here's what you're not noticing. Every time you delay it, you are not just postponing work. You are reinforcing identity. The identity of someone who reacts instead of leads. Someone who waits for motivation instead of setting direction. Someone who understands what to do, but still looks for a softer moment to begin. That's the real problem. Not time. Not energy. Not opportunity. It's the repeated decision to avoid friction. And over time, that avoidance starts feeling like your personality instead of your behavior. You start believing this is just how I am, when in reality, it's just what you've been practicing. So the question is no longer what you want to do. The question is what kind of pattern you are willing to keep repeating. What's happening in your life right now is not random. It follows a structure you've been repeating so often that it now feels normal. There are 3 internal mechanisms quietly running your behavior every time you delay what matters. First is self-deception. This is where you convince yourself that delay is not avoidance. You rename it. You call it, "I'll do it later with more focus." Or, "I just need the right time." But underneath that language, nothing changes. The task remains untouched, and your awareness stays active but unused. Second is the avoidance loop. You feel discomfort when facing the task, so you escape it. That escape gives short relief. But the relief creates a return condition. You now need to escape again later. So the cycle repeats. Avoidance creates temporary comfort, but permanent pressure. The longer it continues, the heavier even small tasks start to feel. Third is emotional negotiation. This is where discipline should be, but emotion takes over instead. You start negotiating with yourself. "I'll do it after I rest, after I check something, after I feel ready." But readiness never arrives because it is being defined emotionally, not structurally. So your decisions change depending on mood instead of intention. These 3 mechanisms don't operate loudly. They operate quietly. That's why they are powerful. Look at a simple real-life pattern. You sit down to work or study something important. For the first few seconds, there is clarity. But almost immediately, you feel resistance. Instead of pushing through, you open something else: social media, messages, random browsing. 10 minutes pass. Then 20. And by the time you return, the task feels heavier than it was before. Not because it changed, but because your mind assigned it more emotional weight through avoidance. This is how structure becomes identity without you noticing. You don't wake up and decide, "I will be inconsistent." You just repeat small avoidance patterns until consistency feels unnatural. And the danger is this: once this system stabilizes, even motivation starts working against you. Because motivation increases awareness, but awareness without action increases frustration. So now there are 2 directions forming. One is continuing this cycle where emotion leads and action follows late. The other is interrupting the pattern at the point of discomfort, where everything feels slightly harder but still under your control. That's the real framework running your day right now. Not lack of knowledge. Not lack of time, but these repeating internal mechanisms shaping every decision. 1. The moment you first choose avoidance. Every cycle starts at the exact same point, a small moment where you feel resistance and decide not to act. Not a dramatic decision. Not a big breakdown. Just a quiet refusal. You sit down, you know what matters, and for a few seconds there is clarity. But clarity alone is not enough. Because clarity always gets tested by discomfort. And that discomfort is where your pattern reveals itself. You don't reject the task directly. You delay it. That delay looks harmless, but it is actually the first compromise of the day. You tell yourself it's temporary. I'll start in a bit. But in reality, you are not postponing the task, you are postponing the identity required to do it. Rohn once said, discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. That bridge is not built in motivation. It is built in moments like this. Think of a normal work situation. You open your laptop, you know the one thing that would move your life forward. Instead, you switch to something easier. Not because you don't care, but because your mind is optimizing for comfort in the short term. And that is the first fracture. Because every time you choose comfort over direction, you don't stay the same, you shift slightly. One decision does not change your life. But repeated versions of that decision change your pattern. And here's the part most people miss: avoidance is not neutral. It has momentum. The more you avoid, the more sensitive you become to the task itself. What was once simple now feels heavier just because you postponed it. That's why tomorrow doesn't feel easier. It feels harder. Not because the work changed, but because your resistance increased. So the real question is not why can't I do it? The real question is why do I keep training myself to delay it? Because that is what is actually happening. And once that becomes visible, you can no longer pretend it is accidental. Do you want to continue to the next part? Yes or no? 2. The false relief trap. After avoidance comes something more deceptive than resistance: relief. When you escape the task, your mind relaxes for a moment. That relief feels like reward. It creates the illusion that the decision was correct. But it is not reward. It is reset. You didn't solve anything, you just removed discomfort temporarily. And that removal trains your brain in a very specific direction. Avoidance works. So the next time discomfort appears, your brain repeats the solution faster. This is how discipline silently erodes. Not through collapse, but through repeated relief cycles. You might notice it in small behaviors. You delay work, then check your phone. For a few minutes, you feel lighter. But that lightness is unstable. Because underneath it, the task still exists, unchanged, waiting. And now something worse begins: anticipation pressure. Because now you are not just delaying work, you are carrying awareness of it in the background of everything else you do. You try to enjoy something, but part of your mind is still aware of what you are avoiding. That split attention reduces both focus and peace. This is why rest doesn't feel like rest anymore. And work doesn't feel like work, it feels like pressure waiting to restart. The system traps you between two states, escape and return. And neither gives stability. A simple example: you plan to work on something important for an hour. You avoid it for 30 minutes, then finally start. But now your mind is already fragmented. You are not entering focus, you are entering recovery from avoidance. So the quality drops. And because the quality drops, you justify more avoidance next time. That loop becomes self-reinforcing. Avoidance relief fragmentation, lower output, more avoidance. And slowly, you stop noticing the loop itself. You only feel the outcomes: frustration, inconsistency, and mental fatigue. But underneath it all, the structure is consistent. Do you want to continue to the next part? Yes or no? 3. Identity lock-in through repetition. At some point, this stops being a habit and starts behaving like identity. Not because you declared it, but because you repeated it. Every avoided task sends the same message to your nervous system: this is not something I do immediately. And repetition turns that message into default behavior. So now, even before you decide, your system already predicts your response. You feel the task, and your brain preloads escape options. Not because you are weak, but because it has learned the pattern efficiently. This is what makes change feel harder than expected. You are not fighting a single decision, you are fighting a trained response loop. And the longer it runs, the more automatic it becomes. You don't consciously avoid anymore. You just end up not starting. That's identity lock-in. It shows up in daily life in subtle ways. You might still care deeply about your goals, still think about progress, still imagine different outcomes. But when action is required, the gap appears instantly. Care becomes passive. Execution becomes delayed. And here's the uncomfortable truth: your life is not shaped by what you think is important. It is shaped by what your system executes without hesitation. Right now, your system executes delay faster than execution. That is why nothing feels aligned. Not because you don't know what to do, but because your default response is misaligned with your intention. And unless that default changes, insight alone cannot move anything. Because awareness without behavioral change only increases frustration. You start seeing the gap more clearly, but not closing it. And that is where most people stay stuck, not in ignorance, but in repeated recognition without interruption. Do you want to continue to the next part? Yes or no? For the point of interruption, there is always a single moment where the pattern can break. Not through motivation, not through planning, but through interruption. The interruption happens at the exact point where discomfort appears and your system tries to negotiate. That is the critical junction. Because everything before that moment is automatic. And everything after that moment is consequence. Most people lose right there, not because the task is hard, but because they allow negotiation to happen. They don't interrupt the loop. They enter it. And once you enter, the pattern completes itself. But if you interrupt it, even slightly, you break the chain. Interruption means doing the smallest possible action before the mind can justify delay. Not the full task. Not perfection. Just a direct entry. This is where identity starts shifting, not through grand change, but through refusal to negotiate at the entry point. And over time, something subtle happens. Resistance doesn't disappear, but it stops deciding outcomes. You still feel it, but it no longer controls direction. And that changes everything. Because discipline is not the absence of resistance. It is the removal of permission granted to resistance. Most people wait for resistance to disappear. But disciplined behavior starts where waiting ends. So the interruption is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible, but it is decisive. And once it becomes consistent, the entire system reorganizes around it. Not instantly, not emotionally, structurally. What's becoming clear now is simple, even if it doesn't feel comfortable. Your life is not shaped by what you understand. It is shaped by what you repeatedly allow. And what you've been allowing is a pattern where intention stays high, but execution arrives late, or not at all. That gap is not just a productivity issue. It is a structural identity issue. Because every time you choose delay over action, you are not just losing time. You are reinforcing a version of yourself that treats intention as enough. And intention is not enough. Not in real outcomes. Not in real discipline. Not in real identity change. The uncomfortable truth is that your system is already trained. It already knows what you typically do when resistance appears. And it executes that pattern faster than your conscious thought can intervene. That's why change feels difficult. Not because you lack intelligence or awareness, but because your behavior has become automatic. And automatic behavior always wins over temporary motivation. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They treat it as effort. But discipline is not effort-based. It is identity-based repetition. You don't become disciplined by trying harder in isolated moments. You become disciplined by reducing negotiation at the decision point until action becomes the default response. Over time, that repetition reshapes something deeper than behavior. It reshapes self-respect. Because self-respect is not what you feel about yourself. It is what your actions prove when no one is watching and when no emotion is pushing you forward. If your default response is delay, then your system is currently structured around avoidance. And if your default response becomes action, then your system restructures itself around execution. Nothing else changes the foundation. Not insight alone. Not planning alone. Not understanding alone. Only repetition at the decision point. So the real shift is not dramatic. It is quiet and structural. It happens in small moments where you either continue the old negotiation or you cut it short and act before the conversation begins. And each time you do that, you are not just completing a task. You are adjusting identity weight. One direction builds a self that reacts. The other builds a self that initiates. There is no emotional ceremony around it. No instant transformation. Just accumulation over time until one pattern becomes dominant and the other weakens. That is the real mechanism behind change. At this point, nothing new is being added. Only clarity remains. The pattern has already been exposed. You don't struggle because you don't know what to do. You struggle because the moment of action gets replaced by a moment of negotiation. And that negotiation always favors delay when it is allowed to continue. So the real shift was never about understanding more. It was about allowing less. Less delay. Less internal debate. Less permission given to resistance at the exact moment it appears. Because the longer you stay in conversation with avoidance, the more normal it becomes. And what becomes normal eventually becomes identity without you noticing it forming. This is why discipline never feels like a single breakthrough. It feels like a quiet correction repeated enough times that your system stops offering the old option first. Not because resistance disappears, but because it stops being followed. And over time, something simple settles in. You stop treating discomfort as a signal to delay, and start treating it as the entry point to action. That is the entire shift. Nothing more complicated is required. No new insight. No new motivation. No new version of you waiting in the future. Just a different response in the exact same moment you've already experienced 100 times before. And that response, repeated enough, becomes the structure your life follows without needing permission.